Okay, so this is the Patterson Farm uh, Committee, Master Plan Implementation Committee, meeting for March 13th. And I guess we'll do a roll call, or we can just say everybody's here since there's nobody else online. So that will do that, and we'll move on to approval of the minutes from the last meeting.
The February 13th meeting minutes were distributed with some comments that were updated. I think Dennis and I asked Janelle to make some changes. Any other changes, suggestions? So she has updated those and they're ready for approval. So asking for.
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, all those in favor of approval?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries.
Aye.
Oh. All right, we got to give you a little bit more time. Got it. All right, I was having difficulties here getting my laptop on the Zoom, so I'm sorry for this, but I think I distributed all these files, so everybody's seen them, and we don't have any public online or in here. So regarding the budget, my understanding is what I put in here, and nobody else commented back, was that the ad hoc committee had $166,000 that was not utilized at the end of the ad hoc committee's function, which was set aside by Lower Makefield Township. Those were reallocated to this project. In addition, the ad hoc committee's request for $533,000 was also budgeted, leading to a total budget of $699,000. Amazingly, as of December 31st, 2024, absolutely zero had been spent out of that budget. It should be noted that all the work that was done last year, the phase one efforts, the landscaping, the township council effort to develop the master lease agreement have not been charged against these funds. And whatever the electrical work that was done at Satterthwaite Farmhouse wasn't either, because that service was reinstalled. So at this point, as of the Board of Supervisors meeting last week, the only committed expenditures, the Group 1 and 2 priority buildings for painting and minor carpentry repairs at $177,920, leaving a balance of $521,080. I apologize for the lateness, but I recirculated the ad hoc committee recommendations with what the status on them was. So my understanding of this would be we're not going to get charged at all for any of the items associated with setting that were budgeted in here for setting up the foundation and creating the lease. Is that a reasonable assumption?
I believe it is, yes. We never were told we were going to.
Yeah, I think all the work that's been done to in 2024, the regarding Patterson Farm has, the township has successfully been able to incorporate that into their ordinary operating activities with public works, labor, et cetera.
And Marine's, yeah, and Marine's contract,
Marine's
Dave talked about
yes.
that the last time.
Right. So that's really good news. And I think it might be worth pausing to point out or to just express appreciation to the supervisors for the approval of the PR painting project, consistent with this committee's recommendation to move forward with groups 1 and 2 structures. That's a big step forward and something quite tangible. So that's a significant expenditure that the township is making, and they're kind of putting their money where their mouth is in terms of trying to improve the Patterson Farm site. So we appreciate that support from the supervisors.
Another item that was budgeted that would be open for a question here is, are there any fees or costs associated with the National Register application?
Not so long as I continue to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But we could discuss that a little bit later because I have a plan. I wanted to give people an overview of what work remains to be done. And we could decide how quickly that work needs to be done, and that may determine a different approach.
Okay. So, well, we've been lucky on all those fronts, or maybe not lucky, just good hard effort by everybody in cooperation of the township. What we have had is a discovery of a significant number of environmental issues, which unfortunately have to rise higher up in the priority list, that weren't accounted for at all in the ad hoc committee discussion of work, simply because they weren't caught at the time or were only partially caught. The first one is phase 2 environmental study. This is because of the unlabeled and labeled containers, storage containers, 55-gallon drums, et cetera, and the underground storage tank that's out there. The township is trying to see if they can find a process to have the county do the work like we did with the phase 1 study, but there's no guarantee for that. And that phase 2 study would just be the removal of the tank and the containers and then the sampling of the soil to see if there was any contamination beyond that. So there's cost exposure there potentially for the removal of the tank and the drums, and then there's another potential exposure after that for testing cost, and there's exposure for soil removal in those locations.
Can I ask a question to that? Because I'm not an expert in this field, but why do the tank container need to be removed? Are they continuing to pollute the environment? And is there any other way to remediate that besides?
There isn't another way to remediate it, and the detailed phase 1 report, which does match with what's visible out in the field, is a significant number of the containers that are inside these barns are unlabeled and deteriorating condition. So the containers need to be removed before they cause
Okay.
a pollution problem or more of a pollution problem than otherwise. And in general, I believe that's the same standard with the underground storage tank. In general, they're not using it. We're not planning on using it, and it's a risk. So the sooner it's removed, the better. Although that has been identified as being installed around approximately 1995. I can forward the phase 1 report to the rest of you after this meeting. Dave only got it to me about 6:30 today.
Peter, a question with respect to both of those identified issues. Well, let's take the storage tank. I do not have experience in this realm, and I know the answer. Your answer will largely be it depends. But what magnitude of cost comes into your mind?
If there are no leaks and there's no soil contamination identified with the underground storage tank, will be able to be removed, even if it was done at prevailing wage. It removed, new soil put in for less than $10,000.
Oh, okay.
Now, the issue would be if there's soil contamination. Now we have to deal with oil contaminated soil. Obviously, it's not going to be like the situation that's going on in Upper Makefield Township. This is going to be much more contained than that, but there is that potential. The bigger question is going to be these storage drums and the rest. Again, they're unknown what's in them, although we could take guesses as to maybe some of them are pesticide and some are fertilizer and some are oil products, but we just don't know.
Right.
So they're going to remove those. They'll have to treat that as hazardous for disposal purposes. Again, that shouldn't be that expensive to remove it, but then they're going to have to test the soil, and I would suspect it's likely they're probably going to find contamination in a couple of these barns. Fortunately, that's dry, so the contamination shouldn't have migrated too far.
Okay. Okay.
It's unknown. They're going to find that during okay, that was one of the things Dave's doing to try to mitigate the situation here, is that they wouldn't normally find that until the phase 2, but they're going to wrap in removal of the phase 2, which is normally just a testing protocol. They're going to do removal of the tank and the drums as part of the phase 2 investigation. So that they'll have that removed, and then all we would have is any remaining contamination that's detected during the sampling of phase 2.
And again, this isn't my area of any experience, but it seems if that fuel tank was installed in 1995, that's kind of good news, right? I mean,
It's
that's
kind of
more
good.
recent than I would have expected.
No, it's good, but my question is if the tank's not leaking, then the soil around it is fine.
But we won't know, and then, so they're trying to wrap, because normally part of the phase 2 would be to find out if it's leaking.
I get that, but there are two things. If it's not leaking, you can abandon it in place by getting all the oil out,
Mm-hmm.
filling the tank with sand.
Right.
So it's Dave's choice whether he wants to do the expenditure of excavating it
Mm-hmm.
or waiting to find out if it's inert. Okay, that's all I wanted to
Yep.
do.
Okay. Thank you.
So that's something that Dave is actively working on right now. And it's something that we need to act on. So that was what I've shown here for the items 1 and 2.
And just, excuse me, if Dave is actively working on that right now, do we have any sense of a tentative timeline?
We had a meeting on it in early January. And I wish I could remember the agency name right now, but I'm not going to open a fourth file here. So he was meeting with the agency that had supported the phase 1 test from the Development Authority, to see if they could help assist with this so that we weren't paying the full cost for the phase 2. Go ahead.
I know there was some information from David recently that the consultant firm, I think, is drafting a proposal for the phase 2.
They are, yes.
For presentation to the redevelopment authority.
There you are, the redevelopment authority, yeah.
I don't know the timing though, but it sounded like they were in the works, right?
Yeah. But the question is, will the redevelopment authority pay for the whole cost, or will they only pay for part of the cost? And would the township have to, how much the township would have to contribute open here?
And Peter, on that subject, I think the note in your report is appropriate that the township should budget that amount and then hopefully not have to spend it because redevelopment authority comes through. But until we know that should be in the township expenditure line, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So those were the highest priority item, obviously. Now into the next set of items, and then it sounded, having talked to Fred and Jenifer, like the South Farm access driveway was a very high priority item at the time of the ad hoc committee. So we're showing that as a priority still. Talk about how that fits in priority-wise here in a little bit. The soil lead contamination, which you can see in the Remington and Vernick report from January of 24. It's also referenced again in the phase 1 report. The recommendation in both reports is we need to, a lot of the soils at actionable levels per Act 2 requirements for residential purposes, that we need to either encapsulate or replace the soil as necessary. The total amount of estimated soil between all of the buildings is 977 cubic yards. That adds up to a pretty significant number. In a lot of these places, we're going to have to do soil removal because of how the grade relates to the building, and in order to maintain drainage or improve the drainage next to the building, we have to cut the grade down, so it's going to have to go away. So the question also becomes, do we need design and survey costs included for this This is going to be a very big project when it comes down to it, and it's the natural follow-on to it after PR painting is done on these buildings. It's also possible, another one that Fred and Jenifer and I were talking about was maybe perhaps doing a priority list for removing it. It's still, we'd have to ask what the liability concerns are, but maybe it's buildings we're not using, the soil replacement could be pushed down the road to a later year.
Yeah, on that basis, I guess my thought open for discussion is to get estimates on all the buildings, and then armed with that information, be in a position to make a decision if we're gonna do it all or do it more selectively by building or by priority group. I think the priority grouping will likely make sense because of the timeline associated with these a wide variety of these buildings. Some will be more nearly will be in use more near term. Others will be in use further out. So if there's the ability to stage some of that or to do it in bite-sized units, that would be productive. That's my thought on it. What's the thought of others?
My suggestion was that because it's kind of twofold, it's both the removal or encapsulation of the lead-contained soil and also the issue with drainage around the buildings, that possibly it could be looked at as a combined project, both landscaping and grading to deal with the drainage issues where that's needed, and also the removal or encapsulation. And as you say, Dennis, I think looking at it as a whole for all of the buildings that are involved, and then similar to the painting project, pare it down in priority groups so that, as options, we could deal with maybe some of the buildings later on, but at least get the whole picture to begin with.
I mean, I think it would be, I think it would be okay to have a multi-year plan for it, but I think it should be planned. And what I would want to avoid is that, only part of the buildings are done. The nonprofit might find a purpose or a use for the other parts of the building, and then it takes us 2 years to do the soil remediation, right? Because we know how things work like that. So what I would say is we should think about the entire project. And if it needs to be planned out over a period of 3 to 5 years, that's fine, but it should be planned.
That's kind of where my head is at as well. I was anxious to hear what you were going to give us as a final number for all these.
I will say this one, if it was full bore of, if we had to remove and dispose of all of the soil at a licensed landfill, and there are other alternatives that will reduce that, that could reduce that number. There's even the storing it on site is potentially an option, not in, because we have space. That this would be a few $100,000. If it was full bore, we're going to replace it all, do grading at the same time, and it has to all go to a licensed landfill, and we do no encapsulation. There's going to be some encapsulation. There might be ways to mitigate doing some of this, but the report, if we were to do it as the worst case scenario, it'd be.
So then maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves here a little bit, but hearing that, and then, for example, from a communications point of view, Dennis submitted an article that'll be published shortly, and we talked about the urgency to do other things this year, including, the registry, the 501c3, the lease agreements with AOI and others. I'm trying to get it through. I'm trying to get my mind around whether some of that now gets pushed out and it's not urgent this year, and we focus on the buildings and/or we cut down on the total amount of building renovation we do and start to prioritize some of the other things that we wanted to move forward on, which I think was your point as well.
The one other wrinkle to this here
Yeah.
is that we're going to have to come back to the Satterthwaite Farmhouse because that wasn't in the PR painting that we asked the board to approve. And that's got a soil contamination issue too, and it's a high-profile building. The board of supervisors did ask about that at the meeting last week, and I said, well, that's because we're trying to potentially work out other solutions for that particular building with the Patterson Farm group. So, but that would be a concern. We have to address it sooner rather than later, probably, or there, because the building's going to deteriorate. And if we don't, how that relates to how you're setting up potential sublease agreements or who's going to take responsibility for the exterior paint and envelope situation of that building. We can't do the soil remediation until the building envelope is dealt with. So what's our timeline on making the decision there? Again, as the board pointed out, it's visible, most visible one from the road.
Well, and to me, part of the answer, you're right with the way you structured that, Peter. I agree with the way you structured the question. I think part of that answer is going to be a function of having a master lease agreement so that we can engage in tangible discussions with Patterson Farm Preservation to determine some of their plans and expectations, and we know that organization wouldn't take on the responsibility of the environmental side, but just for that entire site, some of their timing and expectations, I think it would be important to know. So I think engaging in those discussions with a master lease agreement in hand is fundamental to answering the question that you posed.
I think going back to Ron's point, that those, at least in terms of our estimation, the cost to establish the master lease and these other subleases and the National Registry are not high dollar figures, I don't think.
Right.
So budget wise, hopefully those can still continue forward.
Right.
But I just wanted to ask Peter, make sure I understood. So are you saying, Peter, that we can't complete soil remediation until all the buildings are painted?
We can't do soil remediation at a building that hasn't been painted. So we've just agreed that just the PR painting's painting everything but Satterthwaite Farmhouse and one other building.
Mhm.
So we can't do the soil remediation at Satterthwaite Farmhouse because it's not encapsulated.
Right.
And I believe part of that discussion was with Patterson, the preservation group was going to potentially do the painting as part of the envelope repairs of the building.
Well, we decided not to paint Satterthwaite,
We decided not to. The
Because
board
of
of
the-
supervisors.
right? Because of the underlying issues that need to be resolved with the wood, right?
Correct, yes.
But we can't get the Patterson Farm Preservation to do that because the soil is contaminated and we can't get the.
So they could work on there's no reason why they couldn't work on the building. I thought actually, let me rephrase that. I thought there was a discussion that he actually had his lead and EPA
Oh, okay.
that can
Then perhaps I'm wrong.
certificate. Is
Perhaps
that
I'm
correct, Dennis?
Yeah, that is.
Perhaps I'm wrong. Okay.
Okay, so he wouldn't do the soil remediation.
No, I
but-
understand.
But
He
they
could-
could
right.
do if they're going to do the painting
Right.
work, then we would come in after them
Okay,
and deal with
okay.
the soils issue.
Understood. All right.
That brings up another issue, which I didn't have in the list here, but should be a fairly higher priority, would be the asbestos and the animal issue inside Satterthwaite Farmhouse those costs because obviously they can't self-perform that work. And you did have that budgeted as a priority item in the ad hoc committee. So presumably we need to have that, should be a goal this year. Does that make sense for that to be a goal this year?
Uh,
The asbestos and the cleaning out the interior of Satterthwaite Farmhouse?
I certainly understand it should be on the list and somewhat of a priority, but to try to put a timeline on it with so many unknown variables is
Okay.
a bit risky. When we say this year, that's, that's 10 and a half months. We don't even have a master lease agreement. So,
Well, we don't need
all
that.
these things-
We don't need that for the township to solicit to do hazardous materials
Right, right.
within the building, which is why it makes, I'm saying to me, it seems like an item that we would prioritize on because the Patterson Preservation Group isn't going to be able to utilize the building until we accomplish that anyways.
But I guess my question would be, and I think this is where Dennis was headed, is that if we do it and the lease agreement delays and it delays Patterson Farm Preservation getting access, could the situation represent itself where that money's just going to waste? Or has the building been sealed so that animals can't get back in?
Well, the asbestos has to go.
Well, the asbestos has to go.
No matter what.
Yeah.
So,
And in the initial preliminary conversations with Patterson Farm Preservation, we talked about a small group, access to a small group of buildings that didn't necessarily include the Satterthwaite house. We talked about the sheds and the barn, and access to the house was kind of a question mark because of some of these, because of this long list of issues associated with that, with the condition of that structure. So again, yeah, it's that is obviously the biggest, that structure is the biggest challenge from any angle one approaches it from.
Why don't we break it down into pieces? Do we already have a survey for Satterthwaite House for asbestos?
we have asbestos survey for all of the buildings now.
Great.
And in the ad hoc committee to use that asbestos survey to do a budget for abatement and for the animal excrement removal at Satterthwaite. So you had a budget from the ad hoc committee. It was a line item that was picked on the recommendation report.
Why don't we get a real proposal for the abatement so we have a real number?
Okay. Can ask Dave for that. Yep.
That'll help.
That makes sense.
Yep. That leads into the next item, which is there's asbestos identified at about 5 other locations in the between all of the buildings.
Peter, do you have in front of you which buildings? Just is that something it's convenient? If you don't have it, that's fine. But I know the Pack House was one, Satterthwaite House was one.
Janney House was one.
Okay.
One of the barns, one of the garages was. Now the only one space that's immediately relevant, well, the asbestos at Janney House was associated with the because Beth's here now, is associated with the window glazing, which is a stable, non-friable situation. So you wouldn't touch that. You would have that dealt with when the windows were removed for restoration off-site because you don't want an asbestos contractor touching windows. I didn't get that much of a smile out of Jenifer, but I know she's had to watch that, hear that before elsewhere. But there is a little bit of insulation in the boil associated with the furnace there that has to be abated in Janney. There is a pile apparently of asbestos ceiling tiles that's in one of the buildings at the Satterthwaite farmstead. That will need to be cleaned up. Otherwise, there's a couple locations like the packing shed where there's asbestos transite panels, which is obviously a stable item, but you can't drill in it or break it or whatever, make it friable by breaking it up in bits. It's not a lot. If we were to have asbestos done at Satterthwaite, we could probably pick up all these other smaller abatement items that are inside the other buildings for not much additional cost. Like I said, one's a pile, a ceiling tile, another one's a couple square feet of insulation at the furnace, and transite panels. It's that sort of items. They could be bundled with doing the asbestos at Satterthwaite, which is by far the largest item. Or not. We could say we could deal with it separately later by building, when we're doing renovations in each building. But I would recommend I'm just making a personal recommendation here that we would actually want to, if they did come out, deal with the pile of ceiling tiles that's in the one building and probably deal with the furnace insulation at Janney. Just because the one's an active hazard sitting there and the other one is an active use building, and what if somebody went down there?
Right.
Peter, are all these, and excuse me for not knowing it, are all these items you've outlined on priorities, they're all very important, obviously, but are these things that LMT does, or are some of these part of our master agreement with both AOI and with farmland preservation that can be farmed out?
I can't imagine hazardous materials would get farmed out. I just can't imagine that's the case.
Okay.
It's a and I don't know about how the liability would flow down, but I have to believe that the township owns the liability at this point.
Yeah, I've been operating on the premise that these kinds of fundamental environmental issues need to be addressed by the property owner up front. It's not something that a nonprofit or a tenant is going to want to take on any responsibility for. It's one thing to raise money to paint a building or to improve a second floor or something, but to raise money to do environmental cleanup, I don't picture that happening successfully. That's a landlord liability and responsibility.
Jenifer, looks like you got something maybe to say here. Okay, so those are all the mostly new items that we just went through. So I did mention the driveway was one that the ad hoc committee had selected before as a high priority. There also were a couple of buildings that were selected for high priority for repairs. The caretaker's cottage, some work at Janney, and some work at Satterthwaite Farm House. I don't know how those fall in with all these other newer and potentially higher priority costs here, items.
Right.
Can I ask a question about the South Farm access driveway? Is it still there and just not paved, or is it gone?
I went and walked it 3 days ago. I know that the township is having somebody go out there to do initial survey. Dan Grenier mentioned that last week, but they're just going out there to pull a few points. It is definitely not. It stops 100 yards or so short of Yardley Langhorne Road. You can see where it would go to the road because there's a cut through
Mhm.
the embankment and the ditch there, but there's definitely the aggregate stops close to the end of the edge of the field.
Okay.
And just to open the discussion on that, the rationale for that relative priority was that from a infrastructure perspective of having this site safely used by the public and by tenants, it was important that we not have farm machinery and farm equipment passing right through the heart of that homestead. The Janney homestead it's just not safe, and creating its own access because we know the volume of traffic, if you will, that the farm operations generate, and we know that traffic needs to continue in the future. It made sense to correct that traffic access, if you will, first. Some of the parking traffic access associated with the public using the site can be a little more dependent upon future uses, timing of those uses, etc. So those are less known or less certain, at least particularly with respect to timing. So the first step of getting the ongoing agricultural operations out from the heart of that homestead and restoring the old original access that didn't require that made sense. That was part of the logic behind its relative prioritization. And it involves not just that driveway, but also creating a driveway back around the Patterson main barn, so that they're not passing between the barn and those garages, etc. So it's a new and would then tie into that driveway that's currently being used between the two farmsteads in the middle of those fields there. So that was the rationale at the time. I don't know if there are other thoughts or considerations now regarding the relative priority of that or the timing of that.
I believe the rest of you were here for those decisions, not me, however. So I'm listening.
I mean, Dennis, the logic is still sound, you know? I mean, so I think what we made the decisions to say, what do we need to do to prepare the property to have it turned over to a nonprofit so the nonprofit can get tenants. So I think those decisions that we made are still sound. I mean, what we're finding out is that there's, you know, a little bit more than we anticipated. So.
A little bit?
I mean, I would just say that we knew that we didn't have a full view of what was happening on the environmental side. We only had limited information at that time. So, yeah.
Just to move it forward, suggest making a motion that these priorities, understanding that, you know, there is still some uncertainty, obviously, or a lot of uncertainty maybe in some of the cases, but just to use this as a starting point, that the priorities that are listed that Peter has described here, that we go forward based on that and then develop the you know, more detailed timeline and budgeting as we get the information. So I would just make a motion that we use this as the basis going forward as the immediate priorities for budget and scheduling.
With regards to that driveway, I understand what you're saying, particularly it does not seem like something the tenants would be covering since it's for the the farm, not agricultural use, would it make sense to say we want to start looking at getting proposals for design and construction as two separate?
I think it does, and I'm not sure the exact status. I thought some discussion by Jim Majewski. I know that you mentioned, Peter, about him getting a surveyor out there. There was some discussion about maybe a design estimate, but I don't know how formal or tentative that was. I think it makes sense to get a design and construction estimate. We need it on all these priority items, whether it's priority number 1, 4, or 9.
Yeah, I just don't want, I am going to throw my comment in here. Some of these things, you did have budget for design and construction on this
Okay.
drive before.
Okay.
And some of these we're not going to have answers until we get more information. So it's going to have to evolve as we go. That's why, and to your point, Dennis, about starting to move stuff forward, do we ask Dave to start soliciting for design for the driveway? You can always use it, the construction could get pushed off, but at least you'd have the design then.
I would support that recommendation.
Okay, I'll support that because I think that would be helpful if we could get a lot of ducks in a row. And then we can start doing our Chinese menu
Yep.
of what we choose to proceed with first. I do believe, though, that if we want to invite people in to do volunteer efforts, we've got to make
Yeah.
the site safe. So the abatement has to be on top of the list, and I believe it is. But we just need to remember that.
I agree with Jenifer. My comment was by just doing design, it seems like it's more, if you would, paperwork. Like we have more plans, we have more designs, but if we go to the farm, absolutely nothing's happening. And I would rather us use the money that we have to make things happen at the farm at this point and get it to a position where we can bring volunteers on to help us with some of this.
I would support what Joe just said, absolutely.
I think we can move several of these things forward at the same time right now. We need the phase 2 in order to define all the environmental issues. We can start making a priority list. Maybe by the next meeting, we can have some suggestions on how we would see, what buildings could be encapsulated, what buildings require comprehensive regrading. Maybe we can present something internally for our committee review next meeting on that next month. But if this roadway really is a priority, then getting the design at least puts us in a position to move forward with getting that road in the future, if not sooner. I mean, obviously, so the big costs here are going to be associated with what do we do with Satterthwaite Farmhouse and what do we do with the soils issue. But on the other hand, we don't have the phase 2 report because it hasn't even been let yet. So. Or we can keep revisiting this every meeting, which I think might have to be done to a certain extent going forward in order to keep the ball rolling rather than just letting it sit.
I still think, though, when I think about the roadway, to me, it was something that we wanted to do when we were prepared to have visitors at the farm. But we're nowhere close to being prepared to have visitors at the farm. I mean, right now, we'd like to be prepared to get volunteers on to help us with that so we can get tenants so that they can get visitors. So I just see it's something that I think could wait because I'd rather the money be used for things that will help us get tenants at the farm.
Well, I think, as Peter said, a number of these things can go forward in parallel. The getting bids for design, I don't think costs any money. I'm not, and I do think your point is well taken, Joe. And right now that farm access is, priority number 4. It needs to be, as you say, after the environmental things. It's still on the list. It's just lower on the list. So I don't want to. I wouldn't debate that it belongs as number 4 versus number 3 or number 8. But if the township can move a number of these balls forward at the same time, it's important because the environmental assessment phase 2 is not moved very far, if at all. But the calendar keeps moving, so we need to see those things progress. If we do them too sequenced, nothing can move. So until that slowest, rate limiting variable moves. So I think we have to keep pushing on the phase 2 and do as many things as can be done in parallel to get ourselves geared up to act in an informed way.
So I'm reading all this as keep following up with Dave on the phase 2 and the follow-on tasks associated with that. We asked them to start soliciting for all the asbestos abatement. There's nothing to hold that up, it sounds like, and that's a necessary item from the way the board was saying it here.
Right.
We ask for pricing for design for the driveway, and initially our subcommittee here will go out and start looking at the grading associated with these buildings in order to come up with a better sense of the scoping of soil replacement versus encapsulation and how things might be grouped priority-wise in order to deal with the lead contaminated soil. And then otherwise, the group dealing with the lease needs to figure out how Patterson Farm preservation fits in with the group 3 painting buildings that we're not proceeding with.
Yeah, I think,
Is that where we're at? That sounds like where we're at right
I
now.
don't know. I was just going to comment that I kind of get caught up in my socks with this discussion because we had, we were trying to move forward with the 501c3 and the master agreement and all that. But as I listen to the conversation, where I start to wash out is where we started this whole project was we got to get people on the farm. We have to fix the buildings and get people on the farm and show them that something's happening. We were excited when there were candles in the window of Satterthwaite because people could see it from the when they were driving by. So, I'm kind of backing myself into our primary objective here is to get people onto the farm so they see some progress. And perhaps some of these other things broader things that we've talked about may have to take a back seat until we get that done. I don't know, that remains to be discussed, but I guess I'm weighing in with, let's get the farm to the point where we can get people on the farm.
Other than the roadway, I think all of these relate to they're all environmental issues. And that's before we get to the structural issues on these buildings, which there's other ways to tackle, and then obviously Satterthwaite Farmhouse is the big, where do we go with it item right now? Because other than the abatement, we haven't decided to do anything there yet.
And that to me is all about the abatement so that we can have volunteers in there to help clarify and decide what to do with it, because it's the largest dilemma, and to me, if there's a tenant that can help us resolve that dilemma, we should embrace that and try to hurry that along.
So one question I have is if you look at, I mean, obviously doing a phase 2 environmental study, you're going to do that on the whole farm. You're not going to pick out.
No, the phase 1 identified where the phase 2 needed to occur. So it is actually very localized.
Okay.
Having read the phase 1, we already know about all the soil contamination issues from the lead paint. We know about the lead paint. The asbestos has all been, we have those reports are finalized. The phase 2 is really just focused on, is there any leaking from the underground storage tank? And is there any contamination from beyond the containers that are in the
Right.
farm buildings?
Right.
That's really the focus of the phase 2.
Right. But some of the other points that you're looking at with regards to, priority 5 and asbestos removal, this,
We're moving that up, it sounds like.
right,
in
but
a
I was saying
decision.
it could be done. I'm thinking about Ron's point of saying, if we wanted to get people there, could we isolate a specific building or 2 buildings or something and focus all the effort, all 7, right? I mean, all the way down to say, can we get this volunteer ready? Or do we have to handle all of the like soil remediation for the entire farm at the same time?
There's going to be some things have to be dealt with. The phase 2 is going to have to be dealt with. There's liability issues associated with that. It's going to have to be dealt with. It might not turn out to be that big of an issue. As I started with, the budget numbers could be relatively small if they clean it up and they don't find any contamination, but that has to be dealt with. The rest of this, there's a lot of ways it could be tackled. I mean, you can look at that massive spreadsheet I did that combined everybody's past building investigations, plus what our walks around out there last year. I mean, you could spend our entire budget. Several of the buildings out there could absorb the entirety of what our budget is in just a building. So that all becomes what do you want to do where? And it might be worth asking the township's opinion, given what Remington Vernick and Gilmore had both put in their reports regarding the soil. The numbers are on the high side.
So does this change the prioritization that Peter summarized here?
I think your other summary was good. I'm glad we're recording the movie, so recording.
I think what we just said was we need to proceed with the phase 2, and that's Dave's working on that and those cleanups, and that will determine one set of action. Another one was to ask Dave to solicit for the asbestos removal. We have the scopes for that. Our subcommittee will go take a look at the grading and potential either replacement or encapsulation by building so that we can talk about it next time, either as individual buildings or groupings. And we could solicit pricing for the driveway or not. I think it doesn't make it for design. I don't see any harm in us asking them to find pricing for it.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then I guess everybody could come in next time and we could talk about building priorities. From the ad hoc committee, the priorities were Satterthwaite Farmhouse, Janney House, and the caretaker's cottage. Satterthwaite Farmhouse, again, is something that we've got to figure out what the approach is or how the other parties play into that. Caretaker's cottage definitely needs work. It's got significant building envelope problems. More than what was indicated in the previous report. It's in the spreadsheet though. And that's contained. So that might be, if you were to try to pick a building to start, that might be a logical one to start with since it's in use. But I think that's, everybody's going to have to bring their own opinions to this and we can talk about it in the next meeting. Are we done with this topic then for today?
Do,
I'll reach out to Dave unless somebody else wants to.
do we want a motion? I think Fred a while ago made a motion about moving forward with this list of this priority list and building the budget. Maybe, as you say, we'll debate the relative priority within the list, but is there an action to be taken, or is this just an improved understanding and we'll take it in the next meeting?
I think you're right. I think we do need to do a motion on this list and then also to add in that we're going to ask the township to solicit for asbestos abatement and for design of the roadway.
You want to make that motion, Peter?
So I
Or unless you want to change that. Go ahead, Joe.
was going to
No,
say,
you're-
maybe the best way to do that then is, again, ask Peter to once again recap what we agreed to. And then based on that recap, one of us can make a motion to move forward as stated.
Okay. Here we go again.
I think if to be strict about the rules, I'll withdraw my motion as nebulous as it was at the time. And we'll go forward as Joe.
All right. So we're going to adjust the priorities from the ad hoc report to incorporate newfound information. The current prioritization will be to continue the Phase 2 environmental study that the township is already working on having performed, to seek solicitation of asbestos abatement numbers for all the asbestos abatement that was previously identified at Satterthwaite Farmhouse and that needs to be abated at the other properties that was recently identified in the Phase 1 report, that any Phase 2 identified contamination items are addressed, that the subcommittee will take a look at the soil grading issues at the different buildings to provide options at the next board meeting, our next board meeting, to go over what priorities and what solutions would make sense for dealing with the soil contamination at the various buildings from the lead. And that the remainder of the board is going to seek more clarity on what we're doing with the Satterthwaite Farmhouse moving forward.
Did you include getting the design?
Oh, yes, we're going to seek and asking for design solicitation for the driveway.
I make a motion that we proceed as Peter just summarized.
Second.
Any discussion? I'm doing this because that was very long and windy and maybe somebody wanted to make an amendment. So, all right, hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Moving on to the next topic. The nonprofit and funding group.
For the nonprofit funding, I guess I'll just comment that the Keystone Historical Preservation Grant application went in before the deadline of March 3. I think it went in on the 1st or thereabouts. That's a grant application for $100,000 that would have a matching requirement. So it would support a project of 200,000 or more if granted. And that the project was focused on the Jenny house exterior, the dormers, as well as handicap access restroom inside for that facility, with then a couple projects as potential add-ons or backups. The township pulled that together in time, and we're pleased that went in. We won't learn the status of that, I think, until approximately year end. Is that right, Joe?
I think they do the announcements in June, and they award the money, or the money's available in September.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you. Oh, it's as soon as June. That's great. Okay.
Any update on the lawyer who was drafting the nonprofit master plan?
No, nothing tangible. I've had discussions with David. The lawyer thought the priority was that it needed to be done this quarter.
Yes, that's all.
And I pointed out that if done means both parties have reviewed it, we're running out of time. I clarified that we need to see a draft well before the end of the quarter if something's to be finalized by the end of the quarter, and that we can't just see the first draft by then. But it's a bit of a mystery why that's taken the amount of time that it has. Anything else from this committee on as an update? Okay.
Okay, next up is Ron with
On.
community communication.
So, as we did during the development of the master plan, we've been committed to communicating with the community, our priorities and our progress or lack thereof, and seeking input from our constituents. I'm just going to spend a minute and summarize some of the vehicles I talked about last time, be very brief, and then some potential platforms we can think about for this year and see if there's a discussion about any of that. Although I think a lot of it will be driven by that first agenda item, frankly. We've got lots of platforms. The township website has news. Dennis drafted something for that, but that will be coming out, I believe, in 2 to 3 months, if I remember correctly. Dennis. Then is the resident engagement, Zen City, Facebook, and they get a lot of coverage on Facebook, 5.4 thousand people. Twitter, linked profile, LinkedIn, YouTube, the newsletter I just talked about. There's also news releases. I mean, we could consider news releases as we did during the development of the master plan. And then for getting input from the community, because we've been committed to that and we should stay committed to that. There are surveys, public hearings, resident advisors, as we did last time. But I think much of the communications effort is going to be driven by the master agreement with the township and moving forward with the 501c3 that will provide an outreach to the community. Surveys to the community right now, I think it's premature, quite frankly, to go out and ask people about it. Identifying and beginning to recruit good board members, I think it's premature from a communications point of view, not premature from a personal point of view, as we identify some people People who are part of the committee could go out and chat with them and see what their level of interest is, are. We've already talked to some experts who may not serve on the board, but who could be expert advisors to us. Town hall, again, I think that's premature at this point. So I think there are probably 4 major platforms we could think about, which again are going to be driven by our ultimate decisions about the first agenda item, I think. The first is finalizing the master lease agreement and initiating the lease discussions with AOI and PFP. That's a major story. I think each of these probably should be considered on their own too, instead of putting them all together. Second is formation of the nonprofit, the installation of the board, the announcement of the capital campaign. Obviously, that's, I think at this point, premature again, but it is a major platform that we'll be looking towards. Third would be the National Registry designation. That's very significant when that comes through, a news release or using some of the township ways to communicate with the community. But it sounds to me like from tonight's discussion that one of the first things we really should be talking about vis-a-vis the township vehicles or even a news release is the building protection and enhancement. And as you summarized, phase 2 and the asbestos activities and what our objectives are in terms of getting the community on the site. I mean, we can certainly frame it in that this has become one of our first priorities for this year and the reasons for that, and that's how we want to proceed. So that's sort of my thinking about it. I wouldn't package those things together. I would take them one by one, because then you can get more out to the community and you can choose your vehicles, which ones you want to use. But it sounds to me like after tonight, we might be holding off on formation of the not-for-profit and moving forward with talking about what we're going to be doing with the buildings and the enhancement of those buildings. Conversation, talk, thoughts.
Just a minor one on the buildings. If there isn't something out about painting starting soon, that should be out there because that's the first highly visible item.
Right. Yep.
That is, that will be covered in the article in the newsletter. But I think that the news that the Board of Supervisors approved that proposal is a source to generate some interest, as well as then once the weather warms and the work actually begins, that's another threshold for some news as well. So
yeah, we need some good, to your point, Dennis, we need some good visuals. We need someone out there, local news with a camera showing pictures of someone painting the buildings and people standing around. I mean, we need some good visuals to bring this story home, I think, and to make it real.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I agree with what you said, Ron, in terms of, the priorities being the environmental issues, so that we can get get the public on site. I agree with all that. I would just be careful not to say that establishing the 501c3 is not a priority, because it still is.
Good point.
A high priority, because there's a lot of wind up and pre-work to be done before any pitch can be thrown by that 501c3. So it needs to get in place as soon as possible, just because it'll have a lot of work to be done before real action could be taken.
Good point, Dennis. Thank you. Hearing no other comment, I pass it on to Joe.
Thank you, Ron. I wanted to share my screen for a moment. Which I can never seem to do very easily on here. Okay.
You're sharing.
Okay, good. Now I'm sharing. What I did, we're making progress on the report, but I took some time to step back and put together at least a high level plan of what needs to be done to get this thing submitted. Because there are some complexities to doing this that come in by the fact that it's a historic agricultural district and what the state requires for showing significance in that sense. So I put this plan together. I labeled it as drafts right now because it's sitting actually with PA SHPO. I asked them for some comments to make sure that I didn't forget anything major. So I hope to have a call with them next week to resolve a few things. And when I have it done, then I will forward it. I'll send it out as an official document. Okay. But I wanted to just share it tonight to give you an idea of what's involved and where we are. And it's broken down into 4 phases. And the first phase is for the most part complete. We've done that. I have a question to them. They want me to put all the information into PA Share. I did that already for each of the farmsteads. The question is that good enough, or do I need to go back into PA Share and create an agricultural district? That's a question I have for them. But looking at the other phases, you can think about phase 2 and phase 3 as research phases. So if you think about this as a thesis, phase 2 and phase 3 become your research phases, and then phase 4 becomes the writing of the thesis, and then phase 5 is actually the defense. So I just wanted to kind of show where we are. So last time I talked about work that Helen and I were doing around the census data. And here, what we were doing was pulling out information around agricultural censuses to show the productivity of the 2 farmsteads versus LMT as a Lower Makefield Township as an average, the average Lower Makefield Township, because that's one of the requirements for significance. Okay, so we did that work. It's done, came out great, not a problem. We have some more work to do around the latter period. We have to do some oral interviews for that. What I wanted to come down to, and I want to show you this step here where there's several worksheets that the state requires that we have to fill out. But I wanted to show you these bullet points to give you an idea that one of the things that we have always said is significant about the farm is that it's been continuously farmed for 300 years. So we're trying to make the case that it has a period of significance for over 300 years, which isn't something that you normally do in a National Register submission. Usually a National Register submission, a building or what have you, is significant for us certain period of time, 10 years, 50 years or something, not 300 years, okay? And that's bringing, I don't say a lot of complexity, it's bringing a lot of work into it because we have to look at these. So the state has established these 4 periods in their agricultural context. And what we need to do is to demonstrate against their criteria for significance that Patterson Farm or the 2 farmsteads individually were significant across all 4 of these time periods. So in some respects, it's like doing 4 National Register submissions because usually you only do this for one time period, okay? So this is a good bit of work that we're doing right now. As I said, we started with some of the data. We still have to pull in some of the other information into that. The next important piece that comes up is we have to do an inventory spreadsheet of the buildings. Now, we have our first draft of this completed because Solor Drury did this for us with the master plan. So we just took all the information out of that and put that in there. There's still some other things that the state wants to see, but I feel pretty good about, at least we're good on the first draft. But once we do that, then we get into actually writing. So this is the writing of the submission itself. And you see, these are all the steps. We got to do a narrative. We got to develop our statement of significance. We got to show the integrity of the buildings and of the farm, and then assemble all of this other documentation that they require. I mean, it's just a matter of going out and collecting it and putting it all together. and then we can submit it. So I show you that. I know that Dennis is going to ask me for a timeline for this, but which I would say if I was working for this full time, I could do, but working as a volunteer is very hard to figure out how much. But just to get a sense that this is something that's going to take at least a better part of this year, and hopefully we can get it to a point, where we're able to do submission towards the end of the year. Again, a lot of it really depends upon these next steps in terms of what information do we have, and the information that we don't have, how hard is it for us to get it? Okay. So I just wanted to kind of give that overview. Once I get this finalized with the state, I'll send it out, and it's an official document that we can use then to track progress on a monthly basis. Any questions on this?
Yeah, Joe, that's really helpful and adds a lot of clarity to the process. What is the role of the state of Pennsylvania versus the National Registry? What is this? It all is funneling through the state, and then
Yeah, it's in general.
Would just educate us a little bit on that, or me on that process.
In general, anytime. So first of all, the National Register doesn't mean that the property has national significance. It could have national significance. It could be significance to a state. It could be significance to a local region. Okay. So it's just a repository. The way that a nomination works is that we fill things out. We send it over to PA, to the State Historic Preservation Office. And only when they're satisfied with the document and believe it's significant, will they send it on to the National Park Service for their review and approval. So if you remember, there's a set of documents that are floating around before this was tried actually on the farmsteads individually. It was done by, I think, Heritage Conservancy, and they aborted the attempt. And if you go back and you read those documents, it was the state who came back and they marked up the documents and said, we need a whole bunch more information. I never figured out why they aborted the attempt, but it only got as far as the state before and state review, and the state asked for additional information and it was stopped. So I'm hoping that in working with the state and them reviewing some of our documents as we go along, it's going to avoid this, throw it over the fence and see what comes back at us, which could delay us a lot longer. So one of the questions I have for them is, what points here are good checkpoints for me to send to you and for you to give us feedback on, because I don't want to have only partial data or bad data and then write a whole narrative based on that, because that's just a waste of time. I'd rather make sure the data is all correct first and then start writing the narrative.
Right. Okay. Understood.
Actually, going back to what Ron was doing on community communications, maybe there's something there on community communications with the time periods and the historic significance there, just to generate interest in the park, not waiting until just that particular piece of it.
I kind of agree. I was going to ask Joe, perhaps after the meeting, what of this, what you'd be willing to share publicly, besides, just indicating that we're going for the National Registry, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting, some of the things we crossed out that we completed. There's certainly, we can spin some stories, out of that, maybe even produce a few visuals too.
Yeah, good.
That could be used.
Okay, yeah.
In addition to that, when you look at this information that you're trying to gather, is there any productivity in using community communications to try to solicit input? If anyone has, farm stories from the 1870s or, if anybody has any information, is that helpful to you, or are you?
There is this area here from 60 to 80, which we have to do, and we have to do some oral interviews. Obviously, through Donna. I mean, Donna could be very helpful with this. We'll be able to pull some of that together. I would say, but other than that, not really, no.
Okay. Okay. Have you reached out to Sam Stewart for that more recent period as well?
Yeah, so that's what Helen and I were talking about. I think one of the things that I still need to do, and I was putting it, sorry, down here, I need to I need to look at the landscape and do an analysis of the landscape. And I have no idea how to do an analysis of a farm landscape. So I was going to reach out. Now that I have some data and I could show Sam what was produced on the farm through these periods, I was hoping that he might be able to help me understand how that relates to the farm as we see it today, right? So, what parts were maybe used for wheat production as opposed to others, where I think we have some sense of where the orchards used to be, for example. So those types of things he might be able to help fill in the dots. But I was waiting until I had the data so I could share with him to show, here's what was produced over these periods. Could you help me understand where it was done?
Okay. Okay.
The other issue that I think is cause for great consternation, always has been, is the aging of the farm buildings. And no matter how much we asked Solor Drury to address this, they did not address it. They kept asking us, when were the buildings built? I'm like, I don't know, you're the expert, right? You tell me. But they did, and in fact, what they used in their report was just the things that was used in the National Register submission by Heritage Conservancy. And if you remember, I talked about these time periods, these 4 time periods. When Heritage Conservancy wrote theirs, they were trying to make a case that the farm was significant from the earliest part of the 1900s, so say 1800 to 1850. And that biased everything they had to say in there. They said all the buildings were built at that time, right? And that's not true. We know that's not true, right? So I really take their submission with a grain of salt, or the data in what they wrote in there in a grain of salt. And part of it, if you read the comments back from SHPO, you understand that you should take it with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, Solor Drury just used that data in the master plan, and so that's not useful for us.
But can I just build on Dennis on your point? In the absence of a lot of communications going outbound from us, I mean, I think Dennis has a good point there. What we could do, perhaps, is get a column, pardon me, get a column in one of the LMT vehicles and start to interview people about their experience with agricultural heritage in Lower Makefield Township, because that could start a kind of branding campaign, and also arts and how art has enhanced this community. So what we would be doing would be to take both of the 501Cs that we'll be dealing with and starting to build that kind of brand in the absence of a lot of hard data about the creation of the 501C and all the members that are on it. These soft stories, really sell, and there's a lot of emotion in those stories. So Dennis, I think it's a great idea.
It does. I like the enthusiasm here myself too. I'm getting too wound up in the hard physical aspects.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so it seems
Joe, we appreciate all this work by you and the Historical Commission. It's a more daunting task than I appreciated prior to your showing this these different phases.
just as a side comment, if it's at all relevant, the environmental phase 1 report pulled documentation going back to 1890 from USGS maps and
Okay.
use in that. So we actually, I'm going to send the link I
Yeah.
got from Dave. So some of that, you probably have all that information, but there
No, I
might be a
don't. I
few
haven't.
pieces of backup information that are within that you could pull out of that report.
No, you can see I haven't actually started collecting any of the maps and aerial information at all yet. I need to do that next because
Okay,
that
well, that's-
shows me how the
that's-
farm sheet.
That's all in that report. So,
Yeah.
okay. Any other business?
Public comment?
Public comment? Microphone's right in front of you there.
You scared her.
All right, next up is Fred.
There are a few things that I picked up on that require contact back to Dave Kratzer and the township. So I think number one is where's the master lease agreement draft? And I don't know if Dennis or somebody else wants to, I see his hand raised.
Yeah, I'll take that. I'll follow up.
I think, Peter, you mentioned you would touch base on the phase 2 of the environmental.
The phase 2, the asbestos is what I was going to follow up.
Right,
on.
there were
And the driveway, their driveway too, particularly since they indicated that they were sending a surveyor out there.
And then you asked that we, as a subcommittee, spend some time looking at the buildings for grading and soil mitigation before the April meeting for our next discussion on that, prioritizing the buildings and that work. Anything else? Anybody else? That's what I had noted. So next meeting is April 10th, Thursday, April 10th, here at 7:30.
Okay.
I know Dennis had kind of surveyed everybody. I think everybody was okay with April 10th.
I might not be able to make April 10th. I'm away.
Yeah, I mean, I think when Katie sent the invite out for. Okay. Make a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second,
All in favor?
Aye.
aye.
Enjoy Florida, Dennis.
Thank you all.
Don't turn the computer off.
Good job.
See you, Dennis.
It's 100 megabytes. I'm not sending it in an email. Yeah, we have that share file, so we have that.
I don't have that.
Copy on that one. Fully prepared. You have a floppy disk in there too? No, but I've got all sorts of GIS and looking at different things. Top report.